Stats aren't everything in fantasy football, but they certainly matter, and I got 10 stats I think you must know before you set your fantasy football lineups for week 5. And don't forget, before you set those fantasy lineups for week 5, you also need to get your pick'ems in on Underdog Fantasy. And if you've never tried Underdog Fantasy before, this is a great time because you're going to get this Dak Prescott free pick on Sunday Night Football. He just needs a yard. You win that pick right out of the gates. And if you join using promo code ENDGAME, not only do you get that Dak Prescott free pick, you also get up to $1,000 in bonus cash. That's right, free cash for you to use on pick'ems. Check out Underdog Fantasy if you haven't yet and join using promo code ENDGAME to take advantage of these offers. And the first stat you need to know this week is 26.5. That is actually the amount of points below Amari Cooper's expected fantasy points that he actually has. That's right. Based on his expected stats, meaning like the targets he's gotten, where he's gotten them, his catchable rate, all that stuff, he should have 26.5 more fantasy points this year, but he doesn't. And I get it. Look, I get it. Expected fantasy points isn't going to help you win your fantasy matchup. Trust me, I have Amari Cooper. I know how aggravating it could be, the ups, the downs. I get all that. But man, if there's ever going to be a week to trust him, it might be this week because they go against the last ranked secondary, the Washington Commanders. I know Marvin Harrison didn't have a huge game against them last week, but what was up with Kyler Murray last week? I have no idea. We got 4 teams on bye. We got major injuries, Rashee Rice, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua. I think you could do worse than Amari Cooper this week. I'm not saying you have to start Amari Cooper, but if you're like looking at your bench and the options are Amari Cooper or some guy that just might get you some points, why not just gamble on Amari Cooper? The next stat you need to know is 46.7. That was Travis Kelce's first read percentage in week 4. But when you look at him the first 3 weeks, his first read percentage was only 14.5, which was low even for tight end standards. That is low. What changed? Of course, the Rashee Rice injury changed everything for Travis Kelce's outlook. Travis Kelce was probably going to be one of the biggest busts in fantasy football this year. But now everything is broken exactly perfectly for you if you have Travis Kelce. Look, there's plenty of luck in fantasy football. You got lucky. Just accept it and start Travis Kelce. I think he's got to be a top 5 tight end pretty much every week. Rashee Rice misses. We don't even know if Rashee Rice is coming back this season at all. We're still not sure about his status, but for as long as he is out, remember Hollywood Brown also out. Xavier Worthy probably not ready to step up. Yeah, Travis Kelce, a top 5 tight end, maybe even better rest of the season. If you got him, thank the fantasy gods. Put him in your lineup. You got a top 5 tight end now. The next stat you need to know is 32. That is where the Carolina Panthers run defense ranks again this year after ranking there last year. And now they just lost one of their stud defensive players, Shaq Lawson, for the season with an Achilles tear. They had already lost one of the best defensive linemen, Derek Brown, in week 1. This defense is in shambles and it's already bad. And now DeAndre Swift comes to town, who was miserable for the first 3 weeks. But we finally saw last week against a bad Rams defense, he had a nice game. Why can't he do that again this week against this Panthers run defense? I'm not saying DeAndre Swift is a must start. I'm not saying start him over better running backs. But Saquon Barkley is out. Tony Pollard, Gibbs, Monty, CMC hurt. Again, if you're choosing between a running back that, like, sure, he might get you some points, or a guy like DeAndre Swift, why not gamble on the upside of Swift? The next stat you got to know is 43. That is Chuba Hubbard's expected fantasy points over the last 2 weeks since Andy Dalton took over the starting job in Carolina. That is 4th among all running backs over that stretch, behind only Aaron Jones, Alvin Kamara, and Derrick Henry. And despite the fact that the Bears have a great defense, no doubt about it. They have a great defense. They are much stronger against the pass than the run. I don't want to say they're like an outright run funnel where you can just attack them on the ground, but if you're going to attack them, that's probably where you are going to attack them. Chuba Hubbard has been phenomenal the last 2 games. He's getting all the work here. He's catching passes. He's got touchdown upside. It would be very hard for me to sit Chuba Hubbard this week. I mean, certainly there are running backs we prefer over Chuba Hubbard. If you want to check out our running back start sit video, you can see where we have him listed among running backs, but he's got to be one of the strongest starts this week. If you got Chuba Hubbard, don't be scared of the matchup. Roll him out this week. The next stat you got to know is 48. That was the percentage of routes that Mark Andrews ran in week 4. Less than half the routes. I don't care who you are. I don't care what position you play. You are not going to be fantasy relevant running less than half the routes. I am pleading with you. Bench Mark Andrews this week. Start almost any tight end over Mark Andrews this week. Look, maybe at some point they're going to get him more involved. Maybe at some point his role is going to expand. Maybe at some point he's going to have one of those games where he has like 6 catches and a touchdown. But until then, you cannot trust this guy in your lineup with the way he's being used in this offense. You know what his greatest feat was in that week 4 game? he laid the block that opened up the run for Derrick Henry to go 87 yards for that touchdown, which is great for the Ravens, not so good for your fantasy team. So bench Mark Andrews this week until something drastic changes. Instead, go out and stream tight end. The next stat you need to know is 0.29. That is Jordan Whittington's target per route run over the last 2 games. Why is this significant? Well, it's significant for a couple reasons. Number one, obviously Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, they're out. That's going to open up opportunities for all these Rams wide receivers. But the reason why it's even more significant, when you look 2 weeks ago in week 3, when everybody was like, oh, sneaky start, he only ran 10 routes that week. But last week in week 4, he ran a team high 28 routes and had a 27% target share. Maybe he's starting to get McVay's trust, and this week he has a very good matchup against the Green Bay secondary, allowing the 7th most points to wide receivers. Look, if you're looking for an upside flex play who's still probably widely available on most waiver wires, go see if Jordan Whittington is out there. I think he could have a sneaky game in week 5. The next stat you need to know is 26.8. That is the combined fantasy points the Colts allowed to Caleb Williams and Justin Fields over their yearly average fantasy points. They gave up 9 points more to Caleb Williams over his average on the season, and a whopping 17.8 points more than Justin Fields' average. Next up, Trevor Lawrence, who's been pretty terrible this year, but according to Rich Rebar on Twitter, he's finished as a QB1 in all 4 of his starts against Gus Bradley. Who's the defense coordinator for the Colts? You guessed it, Gus Bradley. Is he going to have another QB1 week? He certainly could. I mean, everything is there for him. He might be getting Evan Engram back this week. Brian Thomas starting to come along. Christian Kirk showing signs. Why couldn't he do it this week against his terrible Colts defense? Look, Caleb Williams had one good game this year. It was against the Colts. Justin Fields, one good game this year against the Colts. Why can't this be Trevor Lawrence's week? The next stat you need to know is 33.3. That is Brian Thomas Jr.'s first read percentage in week 4. And when you look at it over the last 3 weeks, that number has gone from 17 to 22 to 33. That's the kind of uptick you want to see. And now he gets his Colts matchup, giving up the 9th most points to wide receivers. Not scared about this matchup at all. Not to mention the Colts run cover 3 at one of the highest rates in the NFL, which often leads to a big uptick in targets to the wide receiver 1, to those outside wide receivers. And look, if Trevor Lawrence is actually going to have a QB1 week this week, Brian Thomas Jr. probably also going to have a good week this week. I think this is a great sneaky stack in your DFS lineups. Not a lot of people are going to want to put Trevor Lawrence in their lineups. A great sneaky stack there, but I also think it's going to be a valuable stack in your redraft leagues as well. So look, if you're gambling on Trevor Lawrence because you're hurting at QB, I think you should gamble on Brian Thomas Jr. as well this week. I think they're both set up for big weeks. The next stat you need to know is 19.1. That is how many points below expectation Javonte Williams has scored this year. Now, I get it. He's been terrible, and the Broncos' offense has been terrible, but he showed a little something in week 4. 16 carries, 77 yards. Had 2 catches, albeit only 3 yards here, but hey, that's fantasy points, right? It helps. Now he draws a Raiders defense that's ranked 25th against the run right now, and maybe without Max Crosby once again this week. And when you look at running backs against this defense, Dobbins, 135 and a touchdown. Henry, 84 and a touchdown. Chuba Hubbard, 114 and a receiving touchdown. And last week, Jerome Ford, 85 total yards with 7 catches. Why can't Javonte Williams have one of his better games this week? He showed signs of life last week. There's no one here really that is competing for touches for him. I mean, Jaleel McLaughlin a little bit, but that's really it. So, again, if you're desperate at running back with the buys, with the injuries, I think you could do worse than Javonte Williams in week 5. Then the next stat you need to know is 29.7. That is how many points below expectation Courtland Sutton has scored in terms of fantasy points this year, which leads every player. Like, no player is doing worse compared to expectation than Courtland Sutton, which makes sense because he's got Bo Nix throwing to him and not a lot of accurate passes coming his way. But again, he gets this good matchup against the Raiders this week. He had 3 catches, 60 yards, and a touchdown against the Jets last week. It should be better for him this week. And again, they might be without one of the best pass rushers in Max Crosby, which means Bo Nix should not be under pressure in this game, should be able to deliver a bit more accurate passes to Courtland Sutton. So once again, if you're hurting a wide receiver with buys and injuries, I certainly think you could do worse than throwing Courtland Sutton in as a spot start in week 5. And then the 10th and final stat you need to know is 10. That's where Trey Tucker ranks among PPR wide receivers over the last 2 weeks. That's right, he is the wide receiver 10 in PPR over the last 2 weeks. You look at last week with Davante Adams out, he had a very strong first read percentage of 30 and a target share of 25. Now, those numbers were well below Jacoby Myers, but there's reasons to prefer Trey Tucker this week over Myers, and that's Pat Surtain. Now, I don't think this is going to be a shadow situation like we've seen, with guys like Evans, Garrett Wilson, DK Metcalf this year, but I still think Surtain is probably going to be on Myers much more than he is on Trey Tucker. Maybe that will free Trey Tucker up more in this game for those big plays. He's got that big play home run ability. He's scoring touchdowns. Again, if you're really, really desperate and you need a flyer at the wide receiver position, you could certainly do worse than a guy like Trey Tucker with Adams already ruled out for week 5. So there's the 10 stats you need to know for week 5 before you set those lineups. But what about everything else you need? Who to start, who to sit, who could boom? We got you covered. Check out our week 5 playlist right here.